Today we are going to be looking a little bit into one of the darker situations in life, and it is drug addiction. To a point now where I'm on a pain management protocol and traveling, everything. And it would always seem that every time I try to get further away from my family and core supporters, I'd start going downhill really fast into my addictions. And I've come to that point where I've made the conscious effort and the choice to say enough's enough and I want to do something with my life. And I've started focusing on going back to school now, getting upgrading, starting a YouTube channel. I find now that I have hobbies in my life and starting to focus myself on more positive outlets, that now I've got more money all the time. I've got a continuous home. I've gone out and did adulting, like going out, getting a brand new bed, buying myself a vehicle, paying my bills. Because I'm not just worried about trying to get that next fix, trying to fill that void that was always within me. So having to deal with feelings, that's the one that really got me. I couldn't stand having to feel things. And I reach out to my network and to friends and family, and I talk to people, I open up, and I start focusing on whatever it is that feels like it's such a big issue, and I work through it. I don't just try to bury it down inside of me like as if it's not real or something, because unfortunately it is, and it can really be detrimentally bad to my health, especially if I do not stay on top of reaching out for help, because that's been my biggest challenge throughout my life, was always not being able to reach out for help. It would feel like I was too proud to have to say I need help. I could do it on my own. Because when I first came into becoming an adult, I, from the time of 14, lived on the streets and had to go out and get my own. Never get that time back. I could have so much more stuff in my life already worked out and straightened out if I would have worked on these problems starting at a much younger age, instead of continuously just running and then not having a positive outlook and not think that there's something there worth loving in that hardcore life of just being. I've got my own vehicle, I got a plow, I'm able to help take care of my mom who's up there in age now. And the biggest thing is I've got self-esteem again. I've got modesty. I actually have self-worth. I had some kind of core values that made me worthwhile, and even though now all that stuff I've been through, if I forget where taking that very first drink or that first hit or that first smoke, using that first, where it's going to end up, because it's always going to take you to that same spot, that dead end. Lucky to be alive. This is why it is so important. But now let's get into some other videos too. Here we go.
In the last century, the search had hardly begun.
In the latter part of the 19th century, we really weren't too concerned about addictions. The heroin that was available at the time was in many medicinals. And most of the users at that time were older people. Middle-aged women, in fact, were the main users of heroin. There were two other groups of heroin users in the latter part of the 19th century. One is a group we call the opium eaters. And these mainly were sort of the yuppies of the time. These were the people interested in the arts. And although it was frowned upon, people didn't pay too much attention to this. However, at the same time, we had people in the West Coast who were smoking opium. And a lot of people were very upset about this because the people smoking opium weren't the upper class. They were Chinese workers. And the first punitive laws in this country against the use of drugs was against the Chinese in San Francisco in the 19th century. Now, at the same time that all this was happening, Freud had discovered cocaine.
Freud made a serious mistake. He thought cocaine was a new wonder drug which could cure his patients of their addiction to heroin. Since then, whole societies have made the same kind of mistake.
During the 30s and early 40s, amphetamine was extensively used. During World War II, pilots, air crew members used amphetamine on long missions.
It was only after the war that amphetamines became a serious problem.
In the late 40s, I was a student, a graduate student at the University of Kentucky, and I obtained a position at the Addiction Research Center. Actually, it was the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a prison hospital for the treatment of opiate use, or any drug that was against the law based on the Harrison Narcotic Act.
Kornetsky and his colleagues carefully recorded the effects of different drugs.
When opiates are abruptly withdrawn after chronic administration, an abstinence or withdrawal syndrome emerges, indicating the development of physical dependence. He yawns and is restless, complains of aches and pains, and exhibits fever, goose flesh, excessive sweating, and vomiting. The twitching in the legs has given rise to the expression kicking the habit.
Amphetamines, too, had bizarre effects.
In this scene, the subject is chasing a non-existent butterfly through the air and catching it and handing it to the examiner. He then plucks insects from the skin of his arm.
But the psychotherapy available at the time failed to help these addicted patients.
Well, I became concerned by the fact that it didn't seem like we were doing very much for these people. And I became aware that maybe we were not looking at the proper measure. We really should be looking at why are these drugs reinforcing, why are they rewarding, why do they produce pleasurable effects? Well, about that time in the early 50s, Heath in Louisiana reported some interesting studies in man suggesting that there might be some sort of pleasure area in the brain.
You almost look like you're smiling a bit. Are you?
Oh, no, I might.
Heath implanted electrodes in the brains of chronically depressed patients, hoping to stimulate pleasurable sensations.
I guess I've cracked up all the way. I don't know.
I mean, that's the reason you're smiling.
Probably.
Oh, you look like you're real... What are you laughing about?
I don't know.
Huh?
What do you mean? Doing something to me?
Not surprisingly, the experiments were controversial, but the electrodes did have an effect, especially near an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. Heath even let his patients control their own stimulation.
I find this button the best.
That's number 2 button.
Most pleasurable.
How do you feel?
I made a small joke yesterday. I don't know if I should repeat it or not.
I'd like to hear it.
You think it's worth repeating? What about the very deep, deep electrode all the way down?
You're trying to tell me how it excites you, is that it?
Oh, I think it's somewhat of a sexy button.
Oh. Is that why you said it went all the way down?
Perhaps we get pleasure from drugs because they stimulate the same brain areas as sex and food. Working in Montreal in the 1950s, James Olds devised a crucial test. He worked out a new way to, in effect, ask animals how they felt.
This is a device which trains the animal to turn on the stimulus for himself. Here you notice the animal wandering toward the pedal. When he first touches it, he gets no stimulation. It's not connected yet. Then, one time he touches the pedal, it does turn on the stimulation. You can see the lights go on.
Now, the interesting thing about the old stimulation, the rewarding stimulation, was the strength of it. It was somewhat different than rewarding stimulation for food and water in that there was no satiation. Animals would continue for hours and hours and didn't seem to satiate. They didn't feel full. They would just keep doing it for long.
Their rewards.
Everything is about getting high, and any means necessary to get there becomes rational. If it means stealing something from somebody close to you, then you'll do that. If it means lying to your family, borrowing money from people you know you can't pay back, writing checks you know you can't cover, you do all of those things. And if you're sitting around a table freebasing, it's 5 people freebasing, one of them falls out on the floor and dies, you don't call for help because that's more cocaine for the rest of it.
In the laboratory, which drugs would cause an animal to pay that kind of price?
The fascinating thing was that we found in our laboratory that every single drug that increased sensitivity of the animal to brain stimulation was either an abuse substance or a substance that has potential for abuse.
So James Old's technique of the 50s gave scientists a way of testing for the addictive potential of drugs, and a way to find out where in the brain they acted.
Now, I think there's general agreement that this is the area where the action is in terms of the rewarding effects of drugs, whether they be heroin, whether they be amphetamine, whether they be cocaine or angel dust or whatever, any drug that produces rewarding effects, it's believed this is where the action is.
Using similar methods, Chris Fibiger and his colleagues in Vancouver wanted to know which pleasure areas are active when we crave both drugs and food. They found that the area Heath stimulated in his patients, the nucleus accumbens, is the center of a key network, the dopamine circuit. Heroin seems to act in one way. Cocaine in another. And both hit the nucleus accumbens, which the Canadian scientists recently proved is also active when we crave food.
If we selectively take these dopamine neurons out of that part of the brain, the animal loses interest in self-administering cocaine, it seems. Apparently, the drug is no longer reinforcing. The same story seems to apply for amphetamine. If you destroy these dopamine-containing neurons in the nucleus accumbens, amphetamine self-administration disappears as well. I think this approach is going to be able to tell us something about how the human mind works, in the sense that what is it that causes feelings of pleasure, feelings of sadness, depression, euphoria. All of these things are processes that take place probably involving these reward circuits that we're looking at.
The use of these drugs will often lead to compulsive use. And compulsive use is not certainly limited just to drugs. We have people who compulsively eat, people who are involved in compulsive sex, and this certainly is not normal behavior. The interesting thing about these drugs is that they can produce a compulsive use very easily. They're so rewarding, so reinforcing, that pretty soon all types of behavior are excluded. The person really reverts back to almost a very primitive type of animal.
A heroin addict has volunteered to be given a large dose of morphine, chemically similar to heroin, by scientists at the National Institute for Drug Abuse in Baltimore.
Relax.
Today, using new methods, researchers can at last start to look at where drugs act in the human brain. The new machines reveal why different drugs make us act like primitive animals. Morphine shuts down the higher cortex and leaves the older emotional brain in charge. Cocaine gives a boost to the whole brain, but especially stimulates the primitive centers of emotion. So from those rough and ready experiments in the 1950s, scientists did learn where in the brain many addictive drugs act.
Surgeons drill into man's skull to treat meth addiction. Doctors in China are using brain implants in an attempt to treat a man's drug addiction. This technique is controversial and has struggled to recruit willing participants elsewhere in the world. According to the Associated Press, Chinese surgeons are using deep brain stimulation, or DBS, to treat methamphetamine addiction in its first ever clinical trial. The technique involves a device being surgically implanted onto the brain. This would stimulate targeted areas of the brain in an attempt to stop drug addiction. The surgeon drilled 2 holes through the patient's skull and placed 2 electrodes at the nucleus accumbens. This part of the brain is believed to be connected with addiction. Next, the man had a battery pack implanted on his chest to power the brain device. After 2 days, the doctor switched on the DBS devices to activate the electrodes. According to the Associated Press, there are risks to the surgery. These include seizures, infection, or potential death via brain hemorrhage. Critics believe that human experiments like this are at a premature stage and don't address biological, social, and psychological factors that cause a person to become addicted in the first place. The Associated Press reports there is also concern around issues regarding participants' informed consent in places such as China. Speaking to the Associated Press, investigators from similar US-based studies explained their attempts at trials for treating alcoholism were stopped. This was because study design and preliminary results didn't justify the risk.
That is so true. The brain is the most complex and most useful weapon we have against drug addiction that can either work for us or against us. And a lot of it is reprogramming the brain on how to function without it and how to cope and to be able to analyze what you're given.
In the 12-step model, are the chemicals the brain creates the same as a drug?
There are different types of receptors in the brain that are triggered by particular substances. A case in point is there are opiate receptors in the brain. And for instance, when a person gets a runner's high and the endorphins are sort of kicked into the body, the body responds in a very similar way as if they were ingesting opiates. That's one reason why they're very popular. But although they may trigger some of the same receptors, one is an internally generated substance and one is an externally generated substance, albeit maybe initially a natural substance, but it's going to be having a different effect, even though it may be affecting some of the same areas of the brain. And there's also, with most of these manufactured substances, the possibility of them being diluted or mixed with other substances that the body would not in any way be able to handle. Basically, you are getting drunk on your own internal chemistry. And we experience this all the time. When we have this pleasurable experience, whether it's, well, look at the response. A good example is when you cry. There may be all of this pain that you're going through. There's all of these stories you're telling yourselves. There's these painful images that you're playing through your mind. There's the feelings of, desperation or aloneness or loss. And then you will cry, and I mean a big sobbing cry. And then at a certain point you stop and you feel better. Well, your brain has responded to those intense emotions by releasing substances in the brain which are going to allow you to cope, are going to allow you to have this pleasurable experience, and you can go on living. You're not going to be lost in that grief forever.
Thank you, homies. I hope you liked that. I hope this message has reached somebody. If you have a chance and you aren't part of the hometown team, I ask that you like, comment, and subscribe. It'll help me out a lot more than you know. And until our next recording, thank you, homies, and we ask anyone who's not subscribed to join the team. Thanks, God bless, and have a great day.